none so fierce in battle, none so humble in prayer. These were the words whispered through the Holy Land, about an order of knights who wore no colors but white and bore no symbol but the red cross. They called themselves the Poor Fellow, soldiers of Christ, and the Temple of Solomon. But history would remember them as the Knights Templar. They were born from fire, the fire of the Crusades. When Christian armies seized Jerusalem in 1099, the city became a fragile outpost of faith surrounded by enemies. Pilgrims flooded the Holy Land, men, women, and children traveling through deserts and mountains to pray where Christ had walked. But many never arrived. They were robbed, murdered, or enslaved by raiders along the dangerous roads between Jaffa and Jerusalem. It was there, amid the dust and the blood, that 9 knights made a vow before God. Led by a French noble named Hugues de Payens, they swore to protect pilgrims. Not for gold, not for glory, but for salvation. They took an oath of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and bound themselves to a single mission: to defend the faith with sword and soul alike. At first, they were little more than wandering soldiers, poor in possessions, rich only in conviction. But their faith caught the attention of one man who would change their destiny: Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem. In 1119, Baldwin granted these knights a home, the stables beneath the ruins of the Temple of Solomon. To the pilgrims, it was symbolic: warriors of Christ guarding the temple of God. To the knights, it was sacred ground, and from it, their name was born, the Templars. They fought like no other men in Christendom. In battle, they were terrifying, silent, disciplined, unstoppable. They charged in tight formation, shouting only one cry: Non nobis Domin, non nobis sed nomine tuae gloriam. Not to us, O Lord, but to your name give glory. They wore no jewelry, no ornament. Their white mantles symbolized purity, their red cross, martyrdom. They were not allowed to retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. To flee from battle was to betray Christ himself. And yet, when not fighting, they were monks, praying, fasting, serving the poor. They slept fully clothed, ate in silence, and confessed their sins twice a week. No women were allowed in their presence. No gold could belong to them personally. To the common people, they seemed more than men. Saints in armor, bound by faith and steel. Their reputation spread like wildfire across Europe. Nobles donated land, castles, and wealth. Young knights begged to join their ranks. And soon the Templars became not just protectors, but symbols of God's will on earth. In 1129, the Church officially recognized them at the Council of Troyes. Under the guidance of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, their rule was written, a mix of monastic devotion and military precision. Bernard himself called them new knights for a new age. He wrote, "They fear neither demons nor men. Their armor is faith, their shield is hope, their sword is love." With papal blessing, the Templars became unstoppable. They were answerable only to the Pope, above kings, beyond borders. Through the 12th and 13th centuries, their banner flew across the Holy Land, at Antioch, Acre, and Hattin. They fought alongside kings, defended castles, and shed blood for Christendom. Even when Jerusalem fell in 1187 to Saladin, it was the Templars who stood last, refusing to surrender until every wall was broken. But their courage came with a cost. Thousands died, and as the Crusades faltered, Europe began to change. Faith was giving way to politics, and politics would destroy them. Back in Europe, the Templars had grown rich, too rich. They owned vast lands, built fortresses, and managed treasuries that rivaled kingdoms. They became the bankers of kings, lending money to nobles, storing treasures for monarchs, even creating early systems of credit. For pilgrims, a Templar note could be cashed in any Christian land. For lords, their vaults became safer than castles. In time, the Templars were no longer poor soldiers. They were Europe's first financial empire. And with power came envy, from kings who owed them, and from popes who feared them. By the dawn of the 14th century, they had outlived their purpose. The Holy Land was lost, the Crusades had failed, and Europe began to ask, why do these warrior monks still exist, and who, truly, do they serve? From the shadows of Paris, one man began to ask that question louder than anyone else. A man burdened by debt and consumed by fear. His name was King Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair. He had borrowed more gold from the Templars than he could repay, and so he would destroy them, not with armies, but with accusations, and thus began the fall of God's warriors, not on the battlefield, but on the altar of greed. Paris dawn, October 13, 1307. The air was cold, heavy with rain, and silent with fear. Across France, church bells rang not for prayer, but for judgment. On the king's secret order, hundreds of Templars were seized at once, dragged from their commanderies, chained, and accused of heresy. The arrests were swift, brutal, and absolute. No warning, no mercy. The men who had once defended Christendom now stood accused of betraying Christ himself. King Philip IV, called the Fair for his face, but the Cold for his heart, was a ruler obsessed with control. He had fought wars with England, taxed the clergy, and clashed with Pope Boniface the, whom he once called a devil in robes. His treasury was empty, his debts to the Templars enormous, and so Philip turned to a weapon deadlier than any sword rumor. He whispered that the Templars had turned from God, that in secret rituals they spat upon the cross, worshipped idols, and practiced forbidden rites. The claims were absurd, but the people, hungry for scandal and fear, listened. And the church, divided and weakened, hesitated to act. The king's agents, led by his ruthless enforcer, Guillaume de Nogaret, stormed Templar houses and seized their archives, gold, and relics. Every brother they found was thrown into dungeon cells. There, the real Inquisition began. The Templars were tortured, stretched, burned, starved, until some confessed to whatever their captors demanded. They confessed to sins they never committed, to gods they never worshipped, to oaths they never swore. Some begged for death, others went mad. But still Philip demanded more. He needed the Pope's blessing. At that time, the papal throne was held by Clement V, a Frenchman, chosen, influenced, and controlled by Philip himself. The papacy had been moved from Rome to Avignon, where French politics ruled the church as surely as swords ruled the field. At first, Clement hesitated. The Templars were, after all, God's warriors. But Philip knew how to turn hesitation into obedience. He threatened the Pope with open scandal, claimed the Templars had corrupted all of Christendom, and hinted that Clement himself might be complicit if he remained silent. Finally, the Pope gave in. He ordered a formal investigation, a trial that would seal the Templars' fate. For years, the interrogations continued. Across Europe, in England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, Templar brothers were questioned, tortured, and stripped of rank. Many denied every charge, even under pain of death. Others broke, confessing to lies in hope of mercy. In Paris, the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, stood before the inquisitors. A man in his 70s, weathered by battle, still wearing the red cross on his chest. He swore upon the Gospels that the order was innocent. He declared that their faith was pure, their vows sacred, and their mission holy. But no oath could stop the king's will. Philip needed the Templars to vanish, not because they were guilty, but because they were inconvenient. They held his debts, his secrets, and too much power for one man to control. The trials became theater, a performance of guilt written before the verdict was ever spoken. Templars were paraded through Paris, beaten, chained, broken. Some recanted their forced confessions only to be condemned again. Others stood silent, knowing that no truth would save them. The people watched, confused, fearful, and silent. For the same kings who once called the Templars God's chosen, now called them God's enemies. And few dared question a king who spoke with the Pope's shadow behind him. By 1312 the verdict came. At the Council of Vienne, under royal pressure, Pope Clement V formally dissolved the Order of the Temple. Its lands were seized, its wealth divided, its members scattered. Some joined other monastic orders. Some vanished into exile, and others met their end in flame. But the story was not finished, because the world would not forget the man who carried the cross to the very end, Jacques de Molay. He would face his judgment not in secret, but before all of Paris, and his final words would curse the very men who destroyed him. March 1314. The Seine River glistened beneath a gray Paris sky. Crowds gathered along the riverbanks, merchants, monks, peasants, nobles, all drawn by rumor and spectacle. 2 wooden pyres stood ready on the island known as the Boule de la Cité, flanked by royal guards. The smell of tar and smoke lingered. Atop one pyre stood Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Beside him, Geoffroy de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy. Their hands were bound, their white mantles stained with ash. They were to die as heretics, condemned by the Pope, betrayed by the king. But in the eyes of many who watched, they were not traitors to God. They were martyrs of faith and honor. As the flames were prepared, a royal officer read aloud the sentence, accusing them of blasphemy, idolatry, and crimes against the church and the crown. De Molay listened in silence. When the officer finished, he raised his head, his voice cutting through the cold wind like a sword. He declared, God knows who is wrong and who has sinned. Before heaven and earth, I declare, we are innocent. And those who have condemned us shall suffer divine judgment before the year is out. The crowd murmured, some gasped, others crossed themselves, even the guards hesitated. But the order was given. The torches were lit. Flames roared to life, first licking at the wood, then climbing toward the sky. De Molay did not scream. He stood firm, eyes lifted heavenward, his lips moving in silent prayer until the fire consumed him. Witnesses claimed that his face remained serene, illuminated by the flames, as though defying death itself. Within months, his prophecy began to unfold. King Philip IV, who had orchestrated the purge, died suddenly that same year, thrown from his horse during a hunt. Pope Clement V, the man who had bowed to Philip's will, died of illness weeks before the king. And over the next 14 years, every son of Philip met a violent or mysterious death, leaving his royal line extinguished. The French people whispered that Jacques de Molay's curse had come true, that the fire which burned the Templars had turned upon the crown itself. But curses and politics aside, the destruction of the Templars marked the end of an era. For 2 centuries, they had been the armored soul of Christendom, the defenders of pilgrims, the guardians of relics, the elite brotherhood sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. And yet, it was not the sword of Islam nor the deserts of the Holy Land that destroyed them. It was envy. It was power. It was the greed of kings and the fear of faith unchained. Their castles fell silent. Their flags, the white field with the red cross, vanished from Europe's battlefields. But their legend refused to die. Across the centuries, whispers followed their name, that their treasure was hidden beneath Temple Mount, that they guarded secret knowledge passed down through generations, that their legacy lived on in secret orders that shaped the modern world. From Freemasons to Rosicrucians, from conspiracy to symbolism, the Templar cross continued to cast its shadow over history. Even today, their story survives not just in myth, but in every question that begins with, what if? What if the Templars escaped with their gold to Scotland? What if their ships carried relics to the New World? What if the order still exists, hidden, waiting, watching the kingdoms they once served rise and fall again? The fall of the Templars was not just a tragedy. It was a warning that when faith becomes a tool of politics and when loyalty meets power, the purest ideals can burn in the brightest flames. They were God's warriors. They lived by the sword and died by betrayal. And yet, their memory endures. A brotherhood that may have fallen, but never truly vanished, because some oaths are never broken. They fought for God, they died for kings, and history erased them. But the flame of their story still burns, in forgotten manuscripts, crumbling cathedrals, and whispered legends that stretch across centuries. The Templars were not just warriors, they were a symbol of loyalty, faith, and the fatal cost of power. Their enemies tried to destroy them. Instead, they made them immortal, because some names refused to vanish, some oaths refused to die, and some truths refused to stay buried. If the rise and fall of the Templars stirred something in you, a hunger for the story's history tried to silence, then you are one of us. Join Unsolved History, where every episode uncovers the forgotten corners of our past, where myths meet truth, and where history breathes again. Subscribe now, because the past is not dead. It's only waiting for those who dare to uncover it.